Welcome in live, everyone, on a Friday morning, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. We're just 2 weeks away from the NFL Draft, which would have kicked off, of course, on a Thursday night. Thursday through Saturday, we are just 2 weeks away. Prime real estate in the calendar for this guy, Rick Serritella from NFL Draft Bible. So that's NFLDraftBible.com. Rick, how you doing this morning?
Hey, just here to provide some quarantine medicine, Mark. Always fun to chop shop with you and talk some football.
No doubt. An extra added bonus this year with Rick to provide us some relief to a certain extent. Man, we ran down a number of positions yesterday. What you're going to see from my channel right here over the next several days, folks, is you're going to see our position breakdowns on offense. We've now moved to the defense, so you'll see those releases, but we invite you to bring your comments and questions to the live chat, and we will talk it up with Rick, and I will get those questions right to him. On the edge, Rick, it's Chase Young. He's the guy. Why is he so special? Is there anybody that you can compare him to that we're watching today?
You know, I think the guy that might come to mind is a Julius Peppers. Just big, strong, athletic. This guy is a big impact player. I mean, you're talking about the impact that the Boses have been able to make coming out of Ohio State. I think, when you take a look at Chase Young, what's so exciting about him is I think he actually has the potential to even be better than a Bosa, Joey or Nick. I think, the Bosa brothers were a little bit more polished coming out of Ohio State. And I think, when you look at Chase Young, he's still developing. I think there's still some raw traits there that you could polish and refine a little bit. And I think that his best football, which is kind of scary to opposing quarterbacks in the NFL, I think his best football could still be ahead of him. And his ability to just take over games, make an impact. The most important things in the game of NFL are, one, the quarterback, obviously, and then also, two, protecting that quarterback. But on the defensive side, nothing more important than being able to get after the quarterback and disrupt. And that's quite frankly what Chase Young specializes in.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what the percentages are today in regards to run-pass ratio in the NFL, but it's a little heavy on the pass, of course, compared to what it's been in the past. And you need that guy off the edge or several. They can get the heat on the passer and disrupt him because these guys are just razor sharp, completing 70% of the balls out there in this day and age. I tend to like freak plays, quirky plays, meaning strip sacks, pick sixes, blocked punts, blocked field goal. I just like those kind of and batted balls by defensive linemen at the line. I think it's just fun to watch quarterbacks. It gets into the head of some quarterbacks. A.J. Epinesa is a guy that's big and long, and the big games that I've seen him play in, most notably a couple Penn State games in which he almost single-handedly kept them in the game by just being a disruptor up front, a guy that even if he didn't get right at the quarterback was able to make it difficult for him to see downfield.
Yeah, Epinesa, and also in that game, Yetur Gross-Matos, both of those guys, I think, are traditional 43 hand in the dirt type of defensive ends. And I know Epinesa, he didn't quite have the combine performance that he wanted to. So I think he may have went from the top half of the first round, maybe now into the back end of the first round. I still think he goes in round one. And, he just has the profile. There's just not a lot of these 43 hand in the dirt defensive end guys coming out this year. And I think, Epinesa brings that ability. And as does Yetur Gross-Matos, who, quite frankly, I think he has one of the most intriguing background stories Gross-Matos does from Penn State. Someone who, had his boat was struck by lightning when he was a youngster. He was on the boat with his father and his grandparents, his grandfather. His father was able to hand off Yetur Gross-Matos to his grandfather. His younger brother and father did not make it out of that boating incident, and that happened to him at a very young age. And I think, talk about X factors, give me the guy that stared death in the face. But I think both of these guys, top 50 selections, immediate impact guys, but not a dominant force. Chase Young is a guy who could come in, maybe lead the league in sacks on an annual basis. I think Epinesa and Yetur Gross-Matos are going to be contributors and even double-digit sack guys, but I don't know if they're Honolulu All-Pro type of caliber players. So I think, in this year's edge rushers, after Chase Young, there's quite the drop-off.
All right, folks, we got Rick Serritella on the line from NFL Draft Bible, so take advantage. We've got some comments coming in that we'll get to in just a second when we finish up with the edge rushers. Again, the wild card out there. Who's that guy out there or two that you really like but could be a boomer or bust? Those guys under the radar that you feel could make a splash in their NFL careers.
I'm going to go really digging in the crates here because there's a guy out in North Greenville, Chauncey Haney, that I want to talk about. And nobody's speaking about this man right now, but we had him out at the NFLPA Bowl in Pasadena, and I had scouts tell me that they could see him going as high as round 5. Now, he wasn't invited to the NFL Combine, but this guy is lean, he's long, he's mean, he's quick, he's agile. Again, very raw, coming from the smaller school level. There's also a guy down in James Madison University, Rondell Carter, who I like a lot, transfer from Rutgers, so he has that Power 5 pedigree. And I think, between Rondell Carter and Broderick Washington from Texas Tech, I think these are two guys that folks really aren't talking about that could start at the next level. And, Rondell Carter is intriguing because he could play inside, he could play outside, and he's just been on a tear, at the FCS level the last 2 years. A big reason why James Madison has had so much success. So I'm going small school on your mark there.
People might be surprised that I've actually watched and probably know more about the history of the NFL than I do college football, but we've locked in on college football here, so we take it from that angle. And so there's a number of interesting things to look at the rankings versus the guys getting drafted. And when you watch these guys for 2 to 3 years and see them making plays in big games, and then you see these no-name guys getting drafted ahead of them, people are always shrugging their shoulders like, why didn't you take the guy from Florida State? That's the guy that everybody knows. The two Florida players are a good comparison here. Jonathan Grenard and also Jabari Zuniga. And Zuniga actually ran a better 40 time. And so, again, you got a comparison of two guys that played together, same position. Not one of them was like crazy productive versus the other guy. So why the separation there? Number 9 for Greenard, and you got Zuniga at 15.
Yeah, I think Zuniga was kind of on our radar coming into the season. We kind of expected him to take a step up and be a little bit more dominant this season. We didn't really see him do that. And Greenard, I think, is just based on potential. And when you get into edge rushers and projecting how they're going to develop at the next level, you're kind of trying to predict, who has the athletic traits that you're looking for. And I think Greenard is a guy that if you took the injuries out of the equation, and he's had quite a handful of them, I think, he could be potentially the best pass rusher in this year's draft class. But, the one concerning thing that NFL teams are going to be a little bit frightened about is at one point he actually considered retiring from the game altogether and quitting because of his injuries. So anytime you hear that, teams get a little bit on edge. How much does he love the game? Is he really passionate about football? But he did have some injury history there. I just think from an athletic standpoint, the size, speed, and potential, that Greenard is going to be more appealing to NFL scouts. But, both of those guys, middle rounds, rounds 3 through 5, I could see them coming off the board.
I'm trying to think of the Wisconsin front 7 player that was drafted by the Niners about 5 years ago, had a really good first year or two, and then he took himself off the board, had some injury concerns and some things that kind of compromised his future, and just decided that was going to be that.
Yeah, it happens. And I think, it's actually an increasing trend if you look at the players under 30 who have retired over the last several years. I think, there's a lot of factors that we can contribute that to, but I think that, it's becoming more and more of a reality.
Yeah, Rick Serritella on the line from the NFL Draft Bible. We will have all of his links again. So for about an hour yesterday, Rick and I sat down. We went through the entire offense. We'll be releasing those videos over the weekend, so lock in on those. But we do have a question coming in from Nate561. And, of course, we addressed this yesterday, but we'll give it to Nate here in regards to the Dolphins drafting Tua. They've been linked with Tua from the outset of going all the way back to the end of the last college football season. But now, obviously, the injury concerns are even more of a factor than we thought.
Yeah, and I think we touched base on this yesterday, and just in terms of, if I'm a GM, am I willing to put my job security on the line for a guy who can't stay healthy? And, Tua has not been able to get through a college season. How is he going to get through a 17-game NFL season? And if I'm the Dolphins, I'm looking at it like this. I've got so many needs. Am I really going to give up 4 impact players? Because that's what it's going to cost you, 4 first-round picks, including 3 first-round picks this year and 1 first-round pick next year. So if I built all this time trading off my assets, accumulating all this draft equity, only to invest them all back into an injury-prone quarterback, I'd be very hesitant. Now, that's my personal preference. The Dolphins might say, hey, this guy, if you've got conviction about a quarterback, you truly believe he's a game-changing franchise quarterback, well then, hey, you've got to pull that trigger. Me personally, I'm going to stand put. I'm going to take my chances with a guy like a Herbert, and have a contingency plan in place with the Ryan Fitzpatrick, who helped guide this team to 5 wins playing with a cast of nobodies. So me personally, I'd be hesitant. The Dolphins have really positioned themselves over the last calendar year to have this influx of young talent, 4 impact players, 3 impact players this year, and then a first-round pick next year. Just too much for my liking.
Get Lucas Abner sending in a question concerning Yetur Gross-Matos at Penn State about some allegations about hazing. Do you know anything about that?
I went into Penn State, and that's not something that I did here, so I don't want to speak on something that I can't confirm. I'm sure NFL teams will do their homework on that if there's something to that. And, obviously in this day and age and this era that we live in, I think that's something that, teams will take very seriously if true. So you have to weigh that. And again, I don't want to speculate. I haven't seen those reports confirmed, and the school hasn't told me that.
The NFL draft is just 2 weeks away, and we are diving into the NFL Draft Bible with the author, Rick Serritella, from the NFL Draft Bible, NFLDraftBible.com. Check out the banner when I put it up there. It's the location you need to get to check out his work. He's rating players. I'm talking 75 deep at quarterback. So you're taking the deep dive in regards to all the angles and his evaluation of these players from all the different angles. It's across the board, and we've got guys measured. This is again the NFL Draft Combine metrics right down to the nth degree when it comes to all the measurements here. All right, at linebacker, people just drooling, raving about Isaiah Simmons. He seems to be a pretty obvious choice. Kenneth Murray was a tackling machine at Oklahoma, and with their issues on defense, if he didn't make the tackle, nobody would half the time. Your rundown of the linebackers with Simmons at 1, Murray at 2, Patrick Queen, LSU, a couple LSU players in the top 5 with Jacob Phillips checking in. Zach Bond was a player who made a lot of disruptive plays in the backfield in the Big Ten for Wisconsin.
Yeah, Zach Bond is, I think, one of these hybrid kind of guys. I think depending on who you ask around the league, some people like him as an edge rusher. I think he could also play off-ball linebacker, but he's a candidate now to hear his name called in the first round. I truly believe that just based on the buzz that I'm hearing about Zach Bond. And Kenneth Murray to me is a guy that you heard how well he interviewed at the Combine. And just an intangibles guy. They got him on the chalkboard. I mean, this guy's football IQ is through the roof. You saw Coach Matt Rule after that Baylor game against Oklahoma go up to Lincoln Riley and kind of just say, hey, man, that linebacker Murray you got is incredible. So maybe that's something to keep an eye on when the Panthers come up on the clock. And then Simmons, I had a hard time pegging him in that top 10. I know we're going to talk some Cleveland Browns. In the NFL Draft Bible publication, I have Simmons going to the Browns at number 10, where I think he can play multiple positions, similar to what Jabril Peppers offered there for the Browns. I do like Simmons more as a linebacker than a safety. I think, he could be a little bit more vulnerable at the NFL level. Just everybody's faster, quicker. To put him out at safety at a full-time position, I think might be a liability. But, I mean, this guy, I think he had like 237 snaps in the slot, just covering guys. So, I mean, he is the ultimate executioner of defense, plays multiple positions. And, I think that when you draft an Isaiah Simmons, yeah, it's a great talent to have, but you got to kind of really identify how he's going to fit into your defensive scheme and really plan around that. And I think if he gets into a position where he's linked up in the right system, the right coaches, and they have a defined game plan for Isaiah Simmons, there's no doubt outside of Chase Young, I mean, he could turn out to be the best player in this year's draft.
And there's so many levels to what you do as you kind of combed through that in regards to ranking the players at the position, then kind of giving them a rating because there are obviously levels. You might have three guys that are really, really good, razor thin right at the top. Then you may have a drop off. And then when you got to combine all the positions together to rank them 1 through a zillion, and then match that up against team need and draft order to figure out, okay, are they going to, this is the best player available, but they don't need a tackle. They're going to go somewhere else. And that's probably a bad example. Everybody needs tackles. But you know what the deal is in regards to that. How many of these teams seem to be drafting, leaning best player available regardless? We want the best impact player versus, man, we've really got a hole here and we're going to fill it. So we're going to reach.
It's interesting because there's so many different philosophies in drafting a team. And I'm a firm believer, take the best available talent. You can never have too many good players. And, anytime I can add a blue chip guy, and like Simmons is a perfect example to use, like, hey, I might not have a need at linebacker. I might not have a need at safety. And maybe it goes across with what I just said. You better have a game plan for him. But at the same time, at the end of the day, it's like, hey, what are you looking for? I'm looking for talent. So I want to accumulate the best players. And even if it's quarterback, like, I'm a big subscriber to the Bill Walsh philosophy, draft a quarterback every year, because if you have good quarterbacks, you have equity. And Bill Belichick is a subscriber too, because he takes a quarterback almost every year. Jarrett Stidham last year, and he's flipped these guys: Jacoby Brissett, Jimmy Garoppolo, Matt Castle. The list goes on and on. He's flipped these guys for draft picks. And anytime you have good quarterbacks, you've got draft equity waiting in your back pocket. And that's why you just got to accumulate talent no matter what position it is. But, there are teams that, defer from, like, if I'm the Redskins, right, say Chase Young, we're not on the board for some reason. Why not take a quarterback and, trade off a guy that, the Eagles did it when they had Bradford and Wentz, and the Chiefs did it when they had Alex Smith and Patrick Mahomes. Like, there's no such thing as having too many good quarterbacks. And again, the Bill Walsh philosophy, whether it was Joe Montana, Steve Young, Steve Bono, Elvis Gerback, I mean, there was always quarterbacks being developed. And that's why San Francisco, man, they always were competing because they never had an issue at quarterback. You look at the common denominator of playoff teams in the NFL, they've all got a good quarterback.
And then some of those Bill Walsh disciples went to Green Bay, and they did the same thing. They stockpiled guys behind Brett Favre that later became stars on other teams, like Mark Brunell and Ty Detmer and others. Good system there. I'm looking at these linebackers going again, the deep dive way down the chain, and I'm seeing guys that popped up in college football as stars all over the place, with Khaleke Hudson of Michigan at 21. You've got Joe Bachie, Michigan State, who was just, a guy that just ate up tackles at number 27. Shaq Quarterman, the Miami duo, number 32, and Michael Pinkney at 50. Tay Crowder, a Georgia product, at 51. Jordan Mack at Virginia at number 30. Any out of those guys? Because those guys jump out at me because, again, college football, they played a lot. Most of those guys played from the time they stepped on campus and just accumulated play after play at big schools. Yeah.
So, Jordan Mack is a guy, when I went into Virginia early on in the season, I said, sitting next to the guy in the press box, I'm like, who's this guy? Mack, making all these plays. He's big, he's strong, he's physical. And then, after the season, I think he had a little cleanup on the ankle, a little injury there. And then, from my understanding, this guy is like a rocket scientist. He is, I forget what his major is, but I mean, he's got job offers already, like 6 figures. So, I'm not so sure that he's going to take up the NFL. We'll see. The Miami guys are interesting because you talk about immediate impact players and Michael Pinkney and Shaq Quarterman. These guys stepped on campus from day one and have started the last 4 years. I think that, Pinkney's time speed is a little concerning, as was Quarterman's, I believe, offhand. But I think, Shaq, I got a chance to meet him at ACC Media Day. Man, I could not get this guy to crack a grin or smile. I mean, talk about strictly business. But that's kind of like what I want from my middle linebacker, just a guy that's no nonsense. Can't get him to crack a smile, all business all the time. That is Shaq Quarterman. And, Batchy from Michigan State, I think there's some off-the-field issues there that – he's probably been hurt from this draft process and not being able to meet with the teams and kind of getting to know him there. So I think he'll probably have to make his way undrafted. But talk about a guy who could go undrafted and emerge as a potential starter down the road. He's got all the intangibles there to do that. And then, one guy I will throw out there, Logan Wilson from Wyoming, has got a little bit of a buzz about him. And he just plays with his hair on fire, sideline to sideline, lateral quickness. Tackle machine, Logan Wilson from Wyoming. Don't be surprised if you hear his name called as early as round 2.
Coming up at 1 o'clock Eastern time, we've got Ohio State Buckeyes Live with the best beat writers on Ohio State football from 247 Sports, Rivals, and the Ozone coming up at 1 o'clock Eastern time. And presto, we see an Ohio State guy on the top of the board there, Jeffrey Okudah. This is no big surprise. So your top 4 corners, we got 3 from Ohio State, Florida, LSU. Those guys seem to show up from those schools each and every year. But Okudah is the guy, and I've noted this at a few other positions, that seems to be the undoubted number 1 corner, lockdown, just that good. So what separates him?
I just think the resume, you look at the body of work, his ability to match up against the opposing number 1 receiver week in, week out. And then he's an all-world athlete. So, and he's got the modern day type, the prototypical size-speed combination, can play tight man coverage. And, it's funny because we've been talking Ohio State quite a bit here. I had a chance to talk to Chase Young at the Maxwell Club Awards down in Atlantic City about a month ago. And I said, give me a guy next year that we should be looking out for. And he said, Shaun Wade, the corner from Ohio State, who he spoke even glowingly more about Wade than Okudah, which is scary. He said, Shaun Wade, mark it down, is going to be a top 5 pick in next year's draft. So Ohio State just keeps churning out these corners. Damon Arnett, another guy there at Ohio State that, has been burned on occasion by the deep ball. But, I mean, I think overall he's going to be a solid corner, could be a number 2, number 3 corner at the next level. But, after Okudah, I think there is a significant drop-off. C.J. Henderson from Florida, again, just a big 6'1", 6'2" type of corner, fluid movement skills, coverage ability. And A.J. Terrell, I thought Clemson, to me, he's my number 3 corner after the combine. Not so much from the testing and measurable standpoints, but when I watched Terrell go through the positional work and just his change of direction, his footwork, his back pedal, I'll put that up there against the best of them in this year's draft.
And folks understand that when Shaun Wade left the Clemson college football playoff game in the second quarter due to a controversial targeting play, Trevor Lawrence immediately went downfield on a 3rd and 16, that converted the first down, the targeting, but they had a 3rd and 16 that was a 4th and 16, picked on his replacement, Amir Reep, for a pass interference, and then they scored a long touchdown at Wade's position on Reep. 2 consecutive plays, bam, pass interference, touchdown pass from about 25 yards out. There you go. Shaun Wade's out of the game. Very important there. As Rick tells us, corner, edge rusher, tackle, quarterback. That's how you build a championship team, certainly. Looking at these cornerbacks, it's the toughest position. Do you agree with this? Toughest position to play in the NFL and probably in college football today, the way they throw it at the collegiate game as well. These guys just out there against freak athletes and trying to stay up with them.
Yeah, the way they spread the ball around and spread these formations around, and the RPO offense, just quick reads, quick decision making. It has become very tough, very difficult, and Honestly, I mean, we talked about, how much are they really passing at the next level? I think it's close to 70% of the time. So essentially, your nickel back is considered a starter. And a guy like Tony Pride Jr. from Notre Dame, to me, is as good as a nickel back as anyone in this year's draft. And he had himself a heck of a week down at the Senior Bowl. So if you want an inside slot guy, Tony Pride Jr. is a good candidate there. And, there's a pretty good depth in this year's cornerback class.
Before we move to the safeties, Lucas asking another question here about Jake Fromm, reminding him of a Tom Brady type. Yeah, if you're just going to watch him set up in the pocket, yeah, I can see that comparison. Perfect fit for the Patriots in the 4th or 5th round.
I might shock some people here. I think Jake Fromm is still a candidate to be selected in the 1st round. I think that despite the lack of arm strength, there's something to be said for the pre-snap processing, the ability to dissect plays, process information quickly, get the ball out of your hand, not only fast, but smart. And Jake Fromm is as good of a decision maker as there is of any quarterback in this year's draft. He can work the short to intermediate game. I'm not here to do cartwheels on the table for Jake Fromm. I'm not saying I would take him in the 1st round. What I'm telling you is that there is a market in the NFL. If you look, and we just talked about the spread out attacks, the RPO options, these are all worked in the short to intermediate part of the field. And if you have somebody, I know he's unemployed right now, like an Andy Dalton, who can work that part of the field. I mean, Andy Dalton just started for at least, 7 years in the NFL. I think Jake Fromm is very similar to an Andy Dalton. So to your point with the Patriots, I know Dalton was a guy when he got released. A lot of people said, oh, wouldn't he fit in good with New England? Well, do you really want to pay Andy Dalton $10 million a year when you can have Jake Fromm for half the price?
And Andy Dalton, for much of that time, was playing for playoff teams, too. So he certainly gets made fun of from time to time, but certainly a pretty credible NFL career. Got Rick Serritella on the line from the NFL Draft Bible. It's NFLDraftBible.com. You got to check out the work right there because it's exhaustive. So do the deep dive into the NFL Draft Bible right there. We're talking safeties now. I was immediately caught with a comparison of a Grant Delpit, in my eyes, being a more physical safety. And when we talk about corners needing to be versatile in space and needing to do and have so much more responsibility and pressure on them than they used to decades ago, the safeties, you talk about having to be a run enforcer and having to play in space, and not just against tight ends and fullbacks like they used to. Now it's against pretty accomplished receivers. Grant Delpit seems to be a little bit more on the physical end of that spectrum of safeties, and Antoine Winfield Jr. more the ball hawk.
Yeah. Winfield is one of my personal favorites in this year's draft, and I think he's a playmaker. He lacks the size maybe that NFL teams are craving, but at the end of the day, man, this guy is so talented. Even before the injury, when he missed the year or 2 seasons ago, I mean, as a freshman or sophomore, this guy was making plays all over the field. Obviously, he's got the strong bloodlines, and the Vikings, ironically, have a need for a free safety, and they're right there at the back end of the 1st round. So I would not be surprised if he follows in Dad's footsteps there to Minnesota. And Delpit, to me, I think he's taken a lot of criticism this past year in terms of being able to tackle in space. Maybe that's his biggest flaw and weakness. I think, the criticism has been maybe overkill because, you see where he's been dropped in some of these mock drafts and some of these rankings. I still think he's head and shoulders above the Alabama safety, McKinney. And McKinney, I think, is a very solid player. But I think Delpit is just a better player, a better measurables guy, just built for the next level, and just has that proven resume. I mean, he's really been a big impact player. I think a lot of things that people might get him lost in the mix with that LSU defense. You saw so many guys emerge on that championship run that maybe overshadowed Delpit a little bit, and guys that emerged throughout that stretch run. It's like, hey, remember me? I'm Grant Delpit. I'm a franchise safety. So I think 17 Dallas Cowboys would be a perfect fit. They need a safety there. But, yeah, to me, Delpit, then McKinney, and then you got the small school guys that are so intriguing in Chin and Jeremy Chin from Southern Illinois, and then Kyle Duger from Lenoir-Rhyne. I mean, those guys lit up Mobile and really stated a case for themselves. Chin, I think, could sneak into the first round. Cam Chancellor comparison there. Duger, a little bit older prospect. I think he's going to be 25 by the time the season kicks off. And then for that reason, very hard evaluation. You get this guy, you turn on the film, he's dominating guys at the FCS level, but you say, hey, wait a minute, he's like 25 years old going against 20-year-olds. I think that made Duger a very hard eval.
We got Rick Serritella on the line. Want everyone to keep in mind that we sat down for an hour yesterday, carved through all the offensive positions, including the defensive front as well. So those videos are going to be released soon. So any of the offensive questions I see in the live chat we'll get to in just a second. But those videos are on the way with Rick. When you talk kickers, man, it's just they're not football players, but man, they can be so important. They might be the difference in 3 games, and in the NFL, that's monumental. And they're expected to be so accurate now, which is crazy. And then the PAT's not automatic anymore. That's a bit of an experience each and every time they line up for PATs now with 3 seconds on the clock in a tie game. Rodrigo Blankenship. He's pretty much consensus number 1 as I see it, and as you have it listed right here. Yeah, he missed a few big kicks. One big one against South Carolina in a loss this past year, national championship game again in 2017. So is there a kicker or two, a punter that kind of breaks the curve and is this year's guy that, kind of breaks the trend and is so good you got to go reach and grab?
I think that the wounds from Aguayo a couple years ago when Tampa Bay traded up into the second round to take him, I think the wounds are still fresh, where teams might be a little bit hesitant to pull the trigger that high. Although I do think Rodrigo Blankenship is a pretty solid kicker, and if you need one, I think he does come off the board in the middle rounds. So I think he's our consensus clear-cut kicker. I'll give you a sleeper over at Miami, Ohio, Sam Sloman, who didn't even make the publication, had his pro day workout, I think, after we published the book. But he was kicking 70 yards plus pretty regularly at his pro day workout. Miami, Ohio, one of the schools that did sneak in a pro day. So Sam Sloman from Miami, Ohio, kind of stating a case for himself late. And then, back to that ACC media day, I had a chance to talk to Coach Babers at Syracuse. And he was just ranting and raving about this Hoffinger, Sterling Hoffinger. And so I pounded the table to get him out to Pasadena at the NFLPA Bowl. And he was just booming punts, caught the attention of a lot of NFL scouts. I think he is, him and Brandon Mann from Texas A&M, I think are 2 strong candidates here to get selected on day 3 of the draft.
All right, so one of the great privileges and advantages I have as host and owner of the channel is I can ask about a specific team here at the NFL level. We don't have time to go through 32, but those poor Cleveland Browns. We talked about this yesterday, Rick. I truly, and I am no personnel expert by any stretch of the imagination. There are zillions of people out there sitting on their couches. They could do this as well or better than I could. And I never compare myself to the experts doing this. But when you look at the Browns' track record, and it's regardless of who they've brought in to the front office, rarely have they hit on a first-round pick. Barkevis Mingo, Justin Gilbert, Johnny Manziel, on down the line. And I mentioned Joe Thomas to you yesterday. Obviously, he was a no-brainer. Everybody had him in the top 5 in the draft, and he's going to be in the Hall of Fame. So they did hit on that one. Joe Hayden was a really good player at corner. But besides that, it has been a rough 20 years for that franchise. So when you look at the Browns sitting at 10, who do you like for them? And also, who do you think they're going with? And as you scale down the rest of the draft, who are some of those guys that we may see the Browns consider?
Well, first off, Mark, real quick, everyone subscribe to Mark Rogers TV while we're chatting. We appreciate all the love and support in the chat room and keep it cranking. Cleveland, it seems like they've been cursed going back to Tim Couch. But I will say this, there's a big thing to be said in the NFL for continuity. And when there's no stability, whether it's the front office or the head coach, it's hard to have success. what people fail to realize, first round busts, most of the time it's not because they're not talented. They were taken in the first round because they possess talent. A lot of times it's, the coaching. And when you're constantly turning over the coaching staff, constantly turning over the front office, and, you're not on the same page, it's got to be all connected. Because if your front office doesn't understand what your coaches are looking for in terms of fit, need, characteristic, style of play, implementing a system, well, then you're never going to find the right players to match. And I think that's been the biggest downfall of Cleveland. Every year, it's a new GM, new head coach, new staff. And when you don't have continuity, it's hard. It's extremely hard to have success in the NFL. To answer your question, I think that the offense is pretty legit. I think they've got their quarterback. They've got that running back tandem in Chubb and Kareem Hunt. And say what you want about Baker Mayfield, whether you like him or not, he's their guy. Will Odell Beckham be on the roster after the draft? That remains to be seen. Will they flip him and then have a need at wide receiver? That remains to be seen. I think Njoku at tight end and bringing in Austin Hooper kind of solidifies that spot. So at number 10, if they are going to go on offense, it's got to be probably offensive tackle, right? And I see a lot of people chiming in the chat room. They want Andrew Thomas. They want an offensive tackle. And I would have no problem. I think Wirfs and Becton, like we talked about on the tackle preview show yesterday, will be off the board. But I do think an Andrew Thomas will be available. I do think the other tackle that's slipping my mind, the big four tackles, will be available. So they'll have a chance to add one there. However, there are some holes on defense. And, they could use another corner. They could use a safety big time. They could use a linebacker. They could use some help even on the interior defensive line. So, is a Javon Kinlaw, who we talked about on the defensive tackle preview, available? Is he a guy that could plug in there? Is Simmons, who I mocked in the publication, going to somehow slide? Because I do think that, Tua, Herbert, and Burrow all go in the top 9 there. And then I think we accounted for 2 offensive tackles. So there's 5 guys. Okuda is going to come off the board. So there is a chance now. Isaiah Simmons does slide down to number 10. And to me, I think they would have to make the difficult decision in terms of, do we go with Simmons or do we go with an offensive lineman and continue to stack the offensive side? Now, with the safety concerns, we just talked about, a guy like a Jeremy Chin could be there at the beginning of round 2. So if you want one of those impact tackles, you do have to pounce at 10, because even those tier 2 guys, whether it's Jackson from USC or Josh Jones from Houston, if you're Cleveland and expecting those guys to be on the board when you come back around in round 2, I think the chances are slim to none. So, we'll see. Could they flip Beckham between now and the draft? If so, wide receiver becomes a need, and maybe they take a Henry Ruggs. That would be a surprise, or a CD Lamb. It's possible. I think right now they might be happy to get a second-round pick in exchange for Beckham, because it would be addition by subtraction. The New York Giants learned that a year ago. They were getting criticized for getting rid of him, and now the Cleveland Browns appear to be in that same boat.
It didn't happen with John Dorsey as general manager, and if it didn't happen with him, I don't know when it's going to happen, because, as you mentioned, they've had this revolving door in the front office, and therefore the coaching staffs, and a lot of guys have had that job, and Dwight Clark comes to mind, that had names for doing other things. Obviously, Clark as a great wide receiver, but hadn't proven themselves at that level. Once they brought in John Dorsey, and I looked at his track record and thought, here's a guy that built Super Bowl teams at Green Bay and built a long line of good teams at Green Bay, playoff teams each and every year that Brett Favre was there, into the Aaron Rodgers era. Then he goes to Kansas City, and he's got the 3rd best record in the NFL during the time that he was there and building those really good teams. I thought, this is the guy. This is the guy that's going to get it done, and now he's no longer there. It's crazy.
Yeah, and the thing with Dorsey, to your point, no one's ever going to deny his ability to identify talent. He's a great evaluator. He's one of the best in the game. It's the communication. And, when you talk to those in the scouting community, there's just not a whole lot of trust there. Nobody can trust this guy. And he's not exactly a great communicator. So, those are two elements of the job that, again, you have to be connected. The coaching staff and the GM and the front office, they have to all be connected. They have to constantly be in communication. And, when you lose that trust and when everybody's not on the same page, I don't care who you are. I don't care how good of a talent evaluator you are. You just can't win unless you know how to, deal with people. And, that's something that John Dorsey, if or when he does get his next job opportunity, he's going to have to do a self-reflection in the mirror and improve those aspects.
Rick, you've done so much work forward. You're always thinking the future. Who's the next player? Who's the wild card? Who's the under the radar? You're always looking forward. Have you ever taken a chance or a breather to look back and evaluate these drafts, whether it be to self-evaluate yourself and your evaluation of the players, or just look at the teams or the drafts themselves? 1989 comes to mind as a no-brainer. Troy Aikman, Deion Sanders, Barry Sanders, Derek Thomas in the top 5. And it's like, wow, this was an all-time draft. Versus you look at some of these drafts and you're like, what were these guys thinking? They get paid a ton of money. And maybe about 5 of these guys are great players and about another 5 to 10 are impact players. And then the rest of those 32 in the first round, just where are they? What are they doing? They're on a roster somewhere, most of them. But have you ever taken the time to either evaluate your own process or look at the NFL draft selections and kind of look back and think, wow, they hit it this year, they didn't hit it this year, and why isn't it better?
Yeah, I wish I had more time to dedicate to that aspect of it. And it is interesting. Like, I saw an article today about the 2014 Jets draft. And I think they had 11 picks that year. And pretty much every single one of those selections out of the league. Like, how does that happen? 5 years and every pick is out of the league. And, you just say, hey, well, that was the infamous Jeff Idzik year and what a debacle that was. And, it's hard because, when you get a salary cap guy and then you give him, scouting responsibilities, it usually doesn't work out. And they had the same issue with Mike Tannenbaum before that. For me, like, Leland McElroy coming out of Texas A&M, I thought he was a can't miss prospect. And, really didn't do too much at the next level. And then on the flip side, Zach Thomas for me was like a first round lock and he goes in like the 3rd or 4th round. And I remembering Denver Broncos needed a middle linebacker that year. I'm thinking, hey, this is a layup. Zach Thomas, let's do it. And they take Ashley Lilly from Hawaii. So, the list goes on, and we could probably dedicate a whole show to that. But I do have all the Draft Bible publications here in the room, and I wish I could dig more time into it. But to your point, I'm already looking forward. We got 6,000 guys in the database for the 2021 draft that we're trying to chop down now.
So how long you been doing this, Rick, and how much has it changed for you? And do you think the overall process during
when I started this, the internet was relatively, I don't want to say new, but in 2002, I could count on one hand how many NFL draft websites there were out there. And people would say, why the heck would you write about this? What's wrong with you? And, it's just like, it's something that I always had a passion and a desire for, back when I was in high school and sitting in the back of the class and getting yelled at, I was doing those scouting reports on Keyshawn Johnson back then. And it's just something I've always been passionate for and had a craving to do and just figured out like, hey, I think I have something here. And being able to identify the late round guys, the undrafted free agent guys who fall through the cracks, like Selvin Young from Texas went undrafted and he came in and in that Broncos zone run blocking scheme, I think he had 1,000 yards his rookie season. And, here's a guy who was like 6 foot, 220, ran a 4.50 flat and didn't even get drafted. It's like, how do those guys fall through the cracks? So it's been intriguing. I think the biggest difference between when I started back in 2002 and here in 2020 is just the accessibility, how easy it is. Like, all these draft nicks and all these draft websites out there, they don't realize how lucky they are to be able to Google a player bio page and just have all that information pop up. I mean, I had to contact the schools individually and beg them to send me a media guide. And I remember requesting the DVDs. Hey, can you send me the DVD? And, it's just like now we've got YouTube, we've got player bio. I mean, we've gotten to the point where most colleges don't even publish or print a media guide anymore. But back in the day, those things were considered gold, and now they're just kind of collector's items.
Yeah, I just out of fun pulled up the 2015 NFL draft. I thought, we'll go back 5 years because these guys have been in the league for 4 full seasons and see what we got. And of course, that was the Jameis Winston, Marcus Mariota draft. So you had 2 quote unquote franchise quarterbacks that are struggling right now. Winston obviously had a 30-30 dubious 30-30 touchdown interception year, and Mariota lost his job to Ryan Tannehill, another first-round pick from years gone by from Texas A&M. Dante Fowler went at 3. And here's the other thing with most football fans, unless you're a scout and can really grind it down, if they're not a skill position player, unless you really know that team, do you know that such and such guard has really panned out? You know that he might be playing what happened to this guy. He might be a really good player for a team and nobody knows it, or few people know it. That was the Amari Cooper draft. Brandon Sheriff at number 5 to the Redskins from Iowa. I know Leonard Williams was supposed to be a monster, and he's I don't know how you would rate him at this point, but Kevin White, wide receiver from West Virginia, went to Chicago 7.
How about that? And what's the interesting thing here, as you're saying, rattling off all these names, it sounds like none of these guys even made it to the second contract with the original team that drafted him, which is crazy. And I think, that really is one way to define a successful draft. Like, how many guys did you retain when their second contract came around? How many guys did you say, hey, this guy was valuable enough for us to sign him a second time? And all those guys you're rattling off. And, Kevin White, obviously with the injuries playing a factor there. I think wide receiver is the biggest position with first round bust factor. If you do go look back in recent history, the last 5-10 years, even more so than quarterback. And you mentioned Winston and Mariota. I'd be hesitant to call any quarterback a bust 5 years into it, because we've all seen the Rich Gannons of the world and rumors. But, the fact that both of these guys are going to be on their second team just in a 4 or 5 year span is, who would have predicted that 5 years ago?
Yeah, and the wide receivers we have here, Mari Cooper, really good player. Kevin White, we just mentioned. Devontae Parker, good player with Miami out of Louisville. He's been pretty productive.
Yep. Nelson
Aguilar's playing. He plays.
Yep.
Plays well. USC, Philadelphia Eagles. Then they drop off from there. Brashard Perriman, Baltimore, Central Florida.
Another guy on a second team.
Philip Dorsett playing with Indianapolis out of Miami.
And he's also on another team. He was with Patriots last time I checked.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Those are the wide receivers in the first round. Then we had Devin Smith from Ohio State with the Jets, and he's done nothing. I think he moved on to the Cowboys.
Yeah, I think he's out of the league. He had some injury stuff there going on. So, wide receivers are so risky. And I think that's one of the interesting things that we talked about yesterday on the wide receiver segment, like 55 wide receivers being invited to the combine. I believe that's a record. And it's so top heavy with the star-studded talent. But numbers tell us somebody's going to be a bust, right? They're not all going to pan out. So whether it's Judy or Ruggs or CeeDee Lamb or Denzel Mims, Jalen Reagor, T. Higgins, one or two of these guys at a minimum is going to be a bust. And I think wide receiver has another position just like corner because of the spread attacks, because they're just spreading out, making quick reads, getting open in space and dinking and dunking down the field. It is hard to figure out how these guys translate to the next level. And I think that wide receiver probably has the biggest learning curve when you get to the next level. Like, hey, running back, see ball, hand me ball, hit hole, right? I mean, let's be honest. Like, I can get by with a dumb running back, no offense. Wide receiver, you've got to be able to learn different positions, different sides of the field, inside, outside, X, Y, Z, and be able to run a full route tree. And if you're limited in doing that, well, then you're going to be having a limited role at the next level. So I think wide receivers are just asked to do more. And that whole mental aspect of how do you prepare, how do you study, what's in between here, what's over here. And, those are the X factors that, we'll never be able to determine.
And the margin of error is just not there, as you just outlined, because, of course, I look at this also from the other end of the career, the collegiate career. This is the end of the collegiate career going to the NFL, the transition also from high school when I got my recruiting people on here talking high school to college. And that's why the Alabamas, Ohio States, Clemsons, they bring in 4 or 5 five-star wide receivers because they're signing 25, 26 players. And then if 3 of them don't turn out, they still got 2 or 3 great wide receivers from that class. But the NFL teams don't have that margin for error. They're drafting 7 players.
Yeah, I think, the other interesting point, too, we talked about this yesterday, I think specifically with offensive linemen and the pipelines in Iowa and Wisconsin. Historically, certain positions there that you can bank on are going to be well-coached positions. And then I think, and I'm a little East Coast bias here in New Jersey, so I'll use 2 local examples. But to me, when I look at players coming out of college and I take a look at, Matt Rule coached players, Greg Schiano coached players, his first stint at Rutgers. People don't realize Rutgers had a 7-year stretch, 7 consecutive years of having a first-round pick. These were not 4 or 5-star recruits. These were 2 and 3-star guys that Schiano developed, the Mohamed Sanus, the McCourty twins, the Deron Harmons of the world. Matt Rule, same thing. Temple tough. There's 2 guys remaining in this year's class that Matt Rule recruited from his time at Temple. That's Isaiah Wright, the wide receiver, and Sean Bradley, the middle inside linebacker. These guys are going to make rosters. Bradley, to me, is one of the best players that we haven't talked about, and he could start for me any day of the week. But, give me those guys, because Rule always said, hey, when I was at Temple, when I was at Baylor, the 4 or 5-star guys didn't want to come here. We had to identify who had the physical traits that we could coach up. So in other words, Rule would always say, hey, I can't get a 4 or 5-star recruit. Well, I'm going to get a guy who's just fast, and I'm going to develop him and mold him and build him into the player that he is today. And, that's why you say, hey, what's New England doing with all these undrafted free agents out of Rutgers? Well, they just well coached, and that transition to the next level, being in that pro style scheme, translates very well. Phil Snow, the defensive coordinator, there's a reason why he follows Matt Rule around everywhere he goes. This guy knows how to develop players, and I think that's another kind of just X factor in the whole evaluation process that you have to just learn as you go.
Yeah, there's a definite curve if you look at NFL players and where they were recruited in regards to their rating of 5-star, 4-star, 3-star, 2-star, and it follows the line that you would think. But there are certainly hundreds of players in the NFL that were under-regarded coming out of high school that it turned out to be really, really good collegiate players because of the coaching and development and because of their own will and determination and smarts. Rick Serritella on the line from NFL Draft Bible. We know that you are just working like a monster these days. So we appreciate you taking the time, Rick, and sitting down with us and carving through all the positions. And again, everybody, we're going to release offensive previews. Quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, offensive line, defensive line are coming in the next few days.
Yeah,
Rick, we appreciate it.
No, I appreciate it. This was so much fun, Mark, and being able to chop shop with you and get that perspective and tuning in all season long. Mark Rogers TV, getting that college aspect. The voice of college football for a reason. It's always a great time to come on here, and yeah, it's been a little bit weird. I got to be honest, talking to, especially being in New Jersey and talking to a lot of folks that are dealing with deaths, dealing with unemployment, dealing with uncertainty. And with the NFL draft still going on, it's been weird dynamic for me personally, just because it's had to be business as usual. I have no choice. And with the whole pandemic X factor being thrown into the equation, it's been the craziest draft season ever. And, I don't know if it's 5 years from now, 10 years from now, there will definitely be a movie made about the 2020 NFL draft. And, I just appreciate the time, the platform. Hopefully we were able to just distract people's minds for a little bit. And that's the goal here. And hey, if you need some time to pass, the Draft Bible is a good way to do it. NFLDraftBible.com, VIP 50 50% off. We're going to do that only for Mark Rogers TV listeners. And you can follow us on Twitter at NFL Draft Bible. We'll have balls to the wall coverage during the draft week. So again, Mark, always a pleasure. Appreciate you so much. And we'll do this again sometime, I'm sure.
Rick, thank you so much. There's no way we could cover the NFL draft without you. So thank you so much for however many years you've been coming on this time of year. We appreciate it. It is just invaluable.
Absolutely. We'll do it again.